Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 9 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to those two positions, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average have been allowing the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups as we approach Week 9. On top of that, I'll then transition into talking about my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also going ahead and presenting statistics in order to justify these players' rankings. Do not forget that rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there's absolutely, without a doubt, going to be injury information that is made public that will absolutely adjust these rankings. So for those of you who are interested in staying up to date with my rankings, of course, subscribe to the channel. This upcoming Sunday morning, starting at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel, primarily because there is a Germany game that starts at 6:30 a.m. So I'll be live streaming for 4 straight hours, answering your guys' questions, while also having updated rankings available on screen throughout the entirety of the stream. Thank you very much. With that all covered, let's go ahead and let's transition into the tight end conversation, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have tight end fantasy points allowed in terms of receiving statistics thus far this season in a half PPR scoring format. So just talking about receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. The Cincinnati Bengals, of course, just gave up a huge number to George Kittle. If I'm not mistaken, George Kittle went for over 140 receiving yards in an incredible game, but that was kind of expected. The Cincinnati Bengals weren't able to stop him a couple years back, and they weren't able to stop him yesterday, considering over the course of this entire season, their defense has been subject to giving up a fair share of points to opposing tight ends, and it's not going to stop this upcoming week, as they'll have their hands full with Dalton Kincaid, the thumbnail of today's episode. Either way, just wanted to go ahead and give you guys some perspective. Now, the Denver Broncos and the Detroit Lions, even though they're advantageous matchups, unfortunately, they are not available to us this week, as the Denver Broncos, the Detroit Lions, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and San Francisco 49ers are all on bye week. Either way, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. I also want to go ahead and share some of the more difficult matchups at the position: the Cleveland Browns, Arizona Cardinals, Buffalo Bills. I mean, just talking about some of these overall plays. The Arizona Cardinals, even though they have played well against the opposing tight ends, they finally gave up their first touchdown last week, as Mark Andrews had himself a great overall performance. An elite tight end in a difficult matchup is still going to find success. I can assure you of that, as long as they're given the ample amount of opportunity. Oftentimes, their overall efforts outshine the efforts of the defense that they're taking on, so I'm not too worried about it. Either way, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 16 tight end rankings, and remind you guys, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, besides subscribing to the channel, you can also travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, I'll send you guys my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. So regardless of what you're doing on Sunday mornings, you can go ahead and have an advantage upon your league mates, while also getting into the fun of playing Underdog Fantasy. At the end of today's episode, I'll be putting together a couple pick'em slips for tonight's game between the Tennessee Titans and Pittsburgh Steelers. So for those of you who are interested in potentially participating, getting those rankings, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And of course, take advantage of tonight's play of 0.5 total yards for new customers who sign up today using code Andrew and make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, of Derrick Henry going higher than 0.5 total yards. Fantastic. Thank you very much for the support. Okay, let's get into talking about the tight end position. We begin with the Kelce tier. And who else is in the Kelce tier besides Travis Kelce himself? He takes on the Dolphins. The Dolphins are the 8th best matchup at the position. They're nearly allowing 11 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. In the last 3 games, the Miami Dolphins have given up great performances to opposing tight ends. New England tight ends, 7 catches for 72. Philadelphia tight ends, 5 catches, 77 and a touchdown. And New York Giants tight ends, 9 catches for 93. That's 10.7, 10.2, and 13.8 half PPR fantasy points. There's certainly a lot of upside within the given matchup, and considering Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes are coming off a very underwhelming performance in Denver, my expectation is a high scoring event between these two teams, and of course a big performance from Travis Kelce. Moving on to our number 2, beginning the A tier, we have Mark Andrews. Again, he has scored 6 touchdowns in the last 7 games he has played. As long as this offense continues to be as elite as they have been, they continue to give him opportunities. I know in the last 2 weeks we have seen Gus Edwards score 4 rushing touchdowns. If you go ahead and spread that out a little bit more, which I expect to see, we will find Mark Andrews finding the end zone far more often than he typically is. But thus far, I mean, once per game is good enough. We'll take that. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen the Seattle Seahawks defense struggle against tight ends, specifically giving up 16.8 fantasy points to Cleveland tight ends and a total of 9.1 fantasy points to Arizona Cardinals tight ends. My expectation is another big week here for Mark Andrews. Moving on to our number 3, the thumbnail of today's video, we have Dalton Kincaid, rookie tight end of the Buffalo Bills. Dalton Kincaid's coming off an incredible performance in the absence of Dawson Knox, in which he had 5 catches on 7 targets, 65 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Last week, he played 84% of the offensive snaps. The offense as a whole played a lot of 11 personnel in comparison to earlier in the season, in which they went ahead and ran a lot of 2 tight end sets, a lot of 12 personnel with 1 running back, 2 tight ends, 2 wide receivers, as the Buffalo Bills kind of revert their offense to prior seasons in which they utilized a lot of spread offensive formations. If you continue to utilize guys like Khalil Shakir to open up this offense in the slot position, it's only going to help find other receiving options open. My expectation for Dalton Kincaid this week, taking on the easiest matchup at the tight end position, allowing nearly 13 fantasy points per game. Most recently, like I mentioned, of course, San Francisco 49ers tight ends, 9 catches for 149. Arizona tight ends, 6 catches, 59 and a touchdown. Tennessee Titans tight ends, we had 5 catches, 55 and a touchdown. That's over 14 fantasy points in each of the last 3 weeks, 2 opposing tight ends. And Dalton Kincaid has had himself 15 targets in each of the last 2 games. This should be a fantastic week for the rookie tight end, having another breakout performance. Moving on to our number 4, we have TJ Hockenson. I thought it was going to be a disservice to rank TJ Hockenson outside of the A tier, primarily because we know that this offense wants to utilize him at a high capacity. Since he was traded to the Minnesota Vikings, he has seen a boatload of opportunity in terms of total targets. In fact, in the last 13 games that TJ Hockenson has played, including the NFL playoffs, 12 of those 13 games consist of 8 or more targets. Jaren Hall taking over the starting quarterback duties obviously is a huge downgrade from Kirk Cousins, but my expectation is that we're going to continue to see the tight end position be utilized. It's the 13th best matchup at the position. They're nearly allowing 10 fantasy points per game on average to opposing tight ends. That's the Atlanta Falcons defense. My expectation, high volume of targets, and hopefully Jaren Hall can just elevate TJ Hockenson to being a solid tight end play within the given week. Moving on to our number 5 to begin the B tier, we have David Njoku. In the last 2 games with PJ Walker, David Njoku has seen 17 total targets. This last week coming off a game in which he had 8 targets, 4 catches, 77 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. It was only a matter of time until David Njoku found himself some consistency of play. And it is ridiculous that last season he was great with Jacoby Brissett, and then as soon as Deshaun Watson showed up, he was terrible. This season, with Deshaun Watson, very inconsistent. With PJ Walker, incredible. Backup quarterbacks know what to do. They know to target David Njoku on a consistent basis, and he'll obviously go ahead and once again see that this upcoming week taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the Arizona Cardinals, yes, they are one of the more difficult matchups in terms of not allowing a lot of fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but they haven't played against many good tight ends. Last week, Mark Andrews, 4 catches, 40 yards, and a touchdown. I wouldn't be surprised if David Njoku demonstrates a very similar scoreline by the end of week 9. Moving on to our number 6, we have Jake Ferguson. Like I mentioned last week in terms of hidden gems, Jake Ferguson has a lot of potential within this offense. I mean, amongst all players in the National Football League thus far this season, he is number 6 in terms of red zone targets, and he also had a bye week earlier this season. So as long as he continues to get himself a high volume of targets within the red zone, of course, was able to start out the game against the Los Angeles Rams by immediately scoring within the red zone, an 18-yard touchdown down the seam, incredible. If he's going to continue that trend in the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, they are the 8th best matchup. They're nearly allowing 11 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. My expectation is a higher volume of targets and, of course, a lot of utilization down in the red zone in this high-scoring event between these two teams. Moving on to our number 7, we have Dallas Goedert. In 6 of the last 7 games that Dallas Goedert has played this season, he has gotten himself a bare minimum of 4 receptions. And he's the number 3 or 4 option within this offense. I mean, A.J. Brown obviously number 1, DeAndre Swift number 2, and then it's between Devonta Smith and or Dallas Goedert as to who is that 3rd/4th option on a weekly basis. Now, last week, it was Devonta Smith who had 7 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously, Dallas Goedert took a little bit of a backseat, but against the Washington Commanders, he hasn't been great in the past. So really wasn't a surprise that he had an underwhelming performance of only 7 targets, 4 catches, 36 yards, and 5.6 fantasy points. Now he has an opportunity of taking on the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys have given up their fair share of points to opposing tight ends as of late. They're the 11th best matchup. They're giving up 10.31 fantasy points per game. Most recently, of course, George Kittle had that game of 3 catches and 3 touchdowns. The Los Angeles Chargers, of course, Gerald Everett scored a touchdown against his team, 5 catches for 35 yards. And of course, most recently, we just saw Tyler Higbee, 5 catches for 45 receiving yards. Even the New England Patriots tight ends combined for 5 catches and 63. There is an expectation that Dallas Goedert should be able to get himself somewhere between 7 to 10 fantasy points in the given week. I'm pretty confident with that. If he has the potential of a touchdown, even better. Moving on to our number 8, we have Kyle Pitts. With the overall transition from going from Desmond Ridder to Taylor Heinicke, the expectation is better quarterback play. Once Taylor Heinicke gets his first team reps with this offense, eventually he is going to be a consistent option and he will elevate the play of a guy like Kyle Pitts. You have to remember, throughout Kyle Pitts' entire career, anytime he is given 6 or more targets, he's averaging over 9 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, exactly 9.18. So it really isn't going to take much to elevate Kyle Pitts to the level in which he can be a top 10 consistent tight end. It's just a matter of, can that quarterback play elevate him? It's going to take a couple weeks in my mind. I'm hoping that we can see immediate boost of opportunity for Kyle Pitts this week, but I think it may take a couple weeks in terms of building a rapport with one another in practice and being able to demonstrate that throughout the games. Moving on to our number 9, we have Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill is a little bit of a tricky player to start on a weekly basis, primarily because you need him to go ahead and score a touchdown in order to be relevant. Now, in the last 5 games, he has consistently played over 40% of the offensive snaps, whether he's lining up at quarterback in terms of, running the ball, whether he's lining up in the inline as a tight end, out wide as a receiving option. It doesn't matter. Taysom Hill can do it all. A jack of all trades. Last week had 2 passing attempts, one of them for 44 yards. The other obviously was incomplete. He had a reception for 14 receiving yards. He had 9 rushing attempts for 63 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. Over 21 fantasy points. Absolutely ridiculous to witness that from Taysom Hill. But really shouldn't be a surprise. In the last 2 years, 2020, 2023, he's been averaging 5.94 yards per carry on average. He has been an unstoppable force. He has scored 14 touchdowns in the last 24 games he has played. That is a 53% rate of scoring a touchdown. All the other tight ends that have a 58% rate of scoring a touchdown over the course of the last 24 games are in this conversation already of being in the top 10 tight ends. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that Taysom Hill is in this conversation. The only worry that I have primarily is the fact that the Chicago Bears run stop defense from weeks 5 through 8 in terms of stopping opposing running backs, they have only allowed running backs to average 2.45 yards per carry. That being said, a lot of it had to do with game script and a lot of it had to do with great play on the side of the Chicago Bears. My expectation is that even though Taysom Hill kind of falls into this category of a running back-esque, considering they're running that wildcat and there's always the potential of him throwing the ball, there is a little bit more potential value within this conversation. Therefore, he's a top 10 option. Moving on to our number 10, we have Trey McBride, another one of these waiver wire pickups. Trey McBride coming off of a week in which he had 14 targets, 10 catches, 95 yards and a touchdown. Majority of that damage was accomplished in the fourth quarter. But over the course of this entire season, Arizona Cardinals tight ends on a per weekly basis are averaging 11 fantasy points per game, 10.4 targets, 7.0 receptions, 60 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown every 4 games. Without Zach Ertz in the lineup, it's going to all go in the direction of Trey McBride. So my expectation, even though they are taking on the most difficult matchup at the position, taking on the Cleveland Browns, and Clayton Tune starting for the Arizona Cardinals, I do expect that Trey McBride will be a lesser play than he was last week, of course, but he's still going to be the security blanket of this offense. Once, in fact, Kyler Murray does return, I'm happy to rank Trey McBride significantly higher. Moving on to our number 11, we have Donald Parham Jr. Now, I don't have any practice reports or injury reports as of Gerald Everett yet. They play on Monday Night Football, so they did not practice on Wednesday. Later today, we will get a report as to whether or not Gerald Everett is available. If Gerald Everett is healthy, he would be in this position. But if in fact Gerald Everett is out, Donald Parham last week in his absence had 5 targets, 4 catches, 43 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Chargers tight ends over the course of this season on a per game basis are averaging 6.5 targets, 4.9 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and 0.86 receiving touchdowns per game, 11.66 fantasy points per game. They have scored a touchdown in 6 of the last 7 games. And as long as that continues to, kind of rack up, the expectation is that Donald Parham could potentially find himself in the end zone against a team like the New York Jets, who have allowed the most receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends thus far this season. So if in fact Donald Parham Jr. is the lone tight end in terms of the receiving game for the Los Angeles Chargers this week, he is absolutely a play. Otherwise, we pivot to Gerald Everett. Moving on to our number 12, we have Logan Thomas. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, coming off of a big week in which he had a receiving touchdown, fantastic. I know he's dealing with a little bit of an injury. We're going to have to wait and see whether he's available this upcoming week. But in the last 3 games, the New England Patriots have struggled against opposing tight ends. We've seen guys like Dalton Kincaid, Michael Mayer, and Jake Ferguson all find success. Specifically, Buffalo Bills tight ends combined for 9 catches, 85. Las Vegas tight ends combined for 7 catches, 94. And Dallas Cowboys tight ends combined for 7 catches and 77. Having allowed 75 plus receiving yards to opposing tight ends that are active within their offenses. Obviously, you look at last week, Durham Smythe isn't an active tight end within the receiving game. When we're talking about active tight ends, if you're going to continue to allow such a high volume of overall yardage, Logan Thomas should be in line for a great overall week. Moving on to our number 13, we have Dalton Schultz. Prior to last week's game, he was on a 3 consecutive game streak of scoring a receiving touchdown. Incredible. We love it. Last week, unfortunately, was not able to find the end zone. I just wish, instead of, handing it off to Dameon Pierce, if it was going to get stuffed anyway, instead of handing it off to the fullback, why don't you go ahead, play action pass to Dalton Schultz and get somebody, more involved instead of a fullback. But nonetheless, he did have a 2-point conversion thrown in his direction. It was failed, but at least we know they're getting him utilized within the red zone. We've seen it in weeks past. We saw it last week. And going forward, hopefully against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, will be utilized within this overall position. The last time Dalton Schultz took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was in the 2022-2023 NFL playoffs. Dallas Cowboys taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the wild card round. In that game, Dalton Schultz, 7 catches, 95 yards, 2 touchdowns. It was a product of the scheme, but hopefully Dalton Schultz can utilize what he did last time against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers up against them this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 14, we have Kmet. I didn't want to go ahead and ignore the fact that this man quite literally had 10 receptions on 10 targets and 79 receiving yards. In the first 2 games with Tyson Bagent, of course, one of them was Tyson Bagent taking over in the second half. So I guess in the first 1.5 games with Tyson Bagent, literally 0 receptions. On Sunday Night Football against the Los Angeles Chargers, had himself a 27% target share within this offense, and now has an opportunity of taking on the New Orleans Saints. Most recently, the New Orleans Saints have given up 12.5, 7.0, and 15.7 to opposing tight ends from the Indianapolis Colts, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Houston Texans. My expectation for another consecutive week of Tyson Bagent should be a negative game script, throwing the ball for majority of the game, and hopefully looking in the direction of his tight end, Kmet. Moving on to our number 15, we have Luke Musgrave. Luke Musgrave takes on the Rams. They are the 4th best matchup at the position, allowing over 11 fantasy points per game. They have allowed the 2nd most receiving yards to opposing tight ends thus far this season. The hope would be that Luke Musgrave can get himself more utilized within the given week. We'll talk about Jordan Love and how that impacts Luke Musgrave later on in today's episode, as he's a ranked quarterback, but nonetheless a decent option. Moving on to the final tight end I wanted to mention, it is Jonnu Smith. As long as Taylor Heinicke can elevate this offense, I think that Jonnu Smith will continue to get himself a high volume of targets. We're just going to have to wait and see what the Taylor Heinicke version of this offense looks like in comparison to Desmond Ridder. Only time will tell, but I do anticipate Jonnu Smith to continue to be utilized and continue to have a high overall snap count and target share within this offense. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the quarterback conversation, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks in terms of passing statistics isolated. Now, the reason why I isolate passing statistics is because the rushing stats that a quarterback gains against like the Washington Commanders, everything that Jalen Hurts was able to put up last week against that defense isn't something that Mac Jones is going to be able to accomplish because he's not a running quarterback. Nonetheless, going into this week, Mac Jones does have a fantastic matchup taking on the Washington Commanders. The Los Angeles Chargers are a great matchup, but typically we're not going to trust starting a player of the caliber of Zach Wilson. The Chicago Bears are a fantastic matchup. That's great for Derek Carr. The Philadelphia Eagles, of course, Dak Prescott, coming off of a fantastic week of 4 passing touchdowns, can hopefully continue that momentum, especially considering Sam Howell just had a 4-touchdown game against the Philadelphia Eagles. Advantageous matchups across the board. We'll take advantage of those, of course. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have some of the more difficult matchups. The Baltimore Ravens, that is tough for Geno Smith. The New York Jets, that is tough for Justin Herbert. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys, that should be tough for someone like Jalen Hurts. Of course, you want to start your studs. So in these scenarios, I'm still going to be starting Geno Smith, Justin Herbert, and Jalen Hurts. But if you do have better options in comparison to my rankings, then of course, go ahead and take advantage of it. Outside of that, let's go ahead and let's talk about my top 16 quarterback rankings, beginning with our number 1, Patrick Mahomes. Obviously, last week, Patrick Mahomes was a little bit under the weather. He's 24 of 38 passing, a 63% passing completion percentage, 0 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions. I think that in itself, and 5.64 fantasy points gives you an understanding that, yes, he was a little bit under the weather. Hopefully, he's healthy, ready to go into this Germany game. They take on the Miami Dolphins, the 7th best matchup at the quarterback position. Elite quarterbacks have played extremely well against this defense. Justin Herbert, over 20 fantasy points. Josh Allen, 36.5 fantasy points. Jalen Hurts, 23.2 fantasy points. We have seen quarterbacks that are at the elite level find themselves a lot of success. Every other team that the Miami Dolphins have played have not been against great quarterbacks. So my expectation is a great overall performance from Patrick Mahomes, bouncing back. I mean, this is the first time that he has had himself a 0 passing touchdown, 2 interception game since 2018 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. So it's been quite some time, and that Jacksonville Jaguars defense was with Jalen Ramsey, Calais Campbell, if you guys remember all those years ago. So just putting it into perspective, I do expect Patrick Mahomes' performance from last week to be a fluke and for him to get back on track this week. Number 2, we have Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's coming off of one of the best performances of his season, 4 passing touchdowns, over 300 passing yards, wasn't able to get much rushing utilization within the game. They did end up utilizing one of their fake QB sneaks to get a touchdown for DeAndre Swift. If you guys haven't checked out that play, that was quite impressive last week. It was only a matter of time in which they utilized it in that capacity. Nonetheless, from weeks 2 through 8 of this season, Jalen Hurts has put up a minimum of 19.8 fantasy points per week. As long as he continues his successful streak here, of course, 20 fantasy points is in line with the upside of having this become a game in which is a shootout between an NFC rival like the Dallas Cowboys. If both these offenses continue to fire back and forth with one another, which I'm hoping to be the case, hopefully it can be as high scoring as the games in which the Philadelphia Eagles have taken on the Washington Commanders. If they can be as high scoring, the upside will absolutely be there for Jalen Hurts. Moving on to our number 3, we have Josh Allen to close out the S tier. Josh Allen takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. Last time out against Cincinnati Bengals wasn't the best overall game, but what Josh Allen has done over the course of this season already is quite promising. I mean, in the last 6 games that he has played, he has 5 rushing touchdowns. As long as he continues to find the end zone with his legs, his fantasy point upside continues to rise. I mean, last week, 7 rushing attempts, 41 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. Just 10 fantasy points alone from rushing statistics, on top of the fact that he had a 78% passing completion percentage, having completed 31 total passes against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. That's the second most passing completions he has had in a game in the last 2 seasons. He's gaining momentum. This offense is beginning to use a lot of 11 personnel, and as they spread out the offense and bring more primary weapons like a Khalil Shakir into the conversation rather than a Dawson Knox, should be a fantastic overall play within the given week. Beginning the A tier, we have Joe Burrow. On the other side of this matchup, my expectation is that Joe Burrow has the potential of reaching the S tier if, in fact, he continues his rushing upside. Last week, obviously looked incredibly healthy coming off of the bye. 6 rushing attempts, 43 rushing yards. That is the healthy Joe Burrow that we know and love. Coming off of a week in which he was perfect. 28 of 32 passing, an 88% passing completion percentage, 280 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns against that struggling 49ers defense. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Buffalo Bills. Last time out against the Buffalo Bills, 2022/2023 NFL playoffs, second round, 2 passing touchdowns, 240 yards, 0 interceptions, and had himself 6 rushing attempts for 31 yards and over 20 fantasy points. As long as Joe Burrow can continue what he does in the passing game, and he can add the extra potential of rushing upside, that is only going to elevate him into the S tier, primarily because for those of you who remember last season, Joe Burrow had 5 rushing touchdowns. When he is a healthy quarterback down in the red zone, he is not afraid to keep the ball and steal some touchdowns from Joe Mixon. So now that he's healthy and back into this conversation, should be a fantastic play. The Bills secondary has struggled since they have lost Tre'Davious White to a season-ending injury. Kyer Elam, a former first-round pick, secondary member cornerback, has been a healthy scratch in the last, 5 weeks now for this defense. That is a little bit concerning. Of course, Joe Burrow should be able to take advantage of the matchup. Moving on to our number 5, Tua Tagovailoa. He takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. This should be a game in which Tua Tagovailoa, if he is not pressured, should find a lot of success. In the games in which the Miami Dolphins have struggled offensively and have not been able to win this season, they have taken on the Philadelphia Eagles and Buffalo Bills. In those 2 games, they pressured Tua Tagovailoa 34 times as a defense. Those 2 teams combined. The 6 other games that Tua Tagovailoa has played this season has consisted of 47 total pressures. 34 in 2 games compared to 6 games of 47. If a defense pressures Tua Tagovailoa, they will find success consistently. So it's just a matter of, can the Kansas City Chiefs go ahead and put pressure on Tua Tagovailoa in the given week? Because if they're not able to, I'm expecting a huge performance, not only out of Tua, but of course Tyreek Hill in a massive revenge game in a higher scoring event in Germany, 6:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be live streaming on the channel. Be sure to swing on by as we'll be watching the game and answering questions for the entirety of Sunday morning. Moving on, we have our number 6, Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson's coming off of an unfortunate performance in which, yes, he played well. He was able to get his team into the red zone, but unfortunately, 3 rushing touchdowns went in the direction of Gus Edwards. Typically, what we have seen is a couple of those overall touchdowns go in the direction of Lamar Jackson, whether it's passing or him keeping the ball and rushing. Hopefully going into the future, specifically in the matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, which is a difficult matchup considering how well their secondary has played over the course of the season. My hope is that Lamar Jackson is going to utilize more of his rushing upside. Again, only had 17 rushing yards last week. If he utilizes more rushing upside, within the matchup, a higher scoring event, is able to complete 2 passing touchdowns, maybe find himself in the end zone on the ground, could very easily be in the S tier. We know he's capable of accomplishing all of that. Was only able to score 12 fantasy points last week, but we have seen other quarterbacks like Jared Goff go for 300 passing yards and 3 touchdowns against the Seattle Seahawks. Joe Burrow, 2 passing touchdowns most recently against his defense, even though they struggled down in the red zone. The expectation is a solid week here from Lamar Jackson. Moving on to our number 7, we have Dak Prescott. Coming off of an incredible performance after the bye week, an 81% passing completion percentage, 25 of 31 passing, 300 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, was able to get some yardage on the ground, which hopefully will only continue. Last time out against the Philadelphia Eagles, week 16 of last season, against that defense, 350 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 41 rushing yards, and 29 fantasy points. It's the 4th best matchup at the position. We most recently saw Sam Howell have literally 397 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns against that defense. I'm expecting a huge week here from Dak Prescott. Moving on to our number 8, we have Justin Herbert. The reason why Justin Herbert, despite how great he has been, is in the B tier primarily has to do with the matchup. Taking on the New York Jets is the 2nd most difficult matchup at the quarterback position. They're allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points, primarily because they've played against a couple quarterbacks that aren't great, but even against elite quarterbacks like Josh Allen week 1. Josh Allen had 4 turnovers. When they took on Patrick Mahomes, they forced him to throw 2 interceptions. When they took on Jalen Hurts, they forced him to throw 3 interceptions within that game. There is a potential in which Justin Herbert may not have as much upside, even though he's coming off a fantastic performance in which he had a 78% passing completion percentage, nearly 300 yards, and 3 passing touchdowns. Austin Eckler getting more utilization within the receiving game only elevates this offense and Justin Herbert. Even though those are great statistics, it was against the Chicago Bears. Now you have to take on an elite defense like the New York Jets. I am a little bit worried about it, but of course firing him up because in many of our scenarios, he's the best option we have. Moving on to our number 9, we have Derek Carr. Derek Carr, in the last 4 games, has a base minimum of 15.7 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. He has been able to put up 300 passing yards in each of the last 3 games, and that is a great sign to see. If, in fact, we get into a position in which they're down in the red zone and maybe they don't utilize Taysom Hill to the capacity which they have in the last couple weeks, considering the run-stop defense of the Chicago Bears over the course of the last month has looked great, there may be more opportunities for Derek Carr to complete some touchdown passes. The Chicago Bears thus far this season, they are the 3rd best matchup at the position, nearly allowing 18 fantasy points per game in terms of passing statistics isolated. Therefore, Derek Carr should be a fantastic play within the given week. Moving on to our number 10, we have Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield, outside of the game against the Philadelphia Eagles and the Detroit Lions, which are elite teams, outside of those overall games, he has been able to put up a base minimum of 16 fantasy points in the 5 other games he has played. He's averaging 18.98 fantasy points per game in those other games that we're referencing to. They take on the Houston Texans. There is an expectation that going up against the Houston Texans, again, this is not a team that is going to run the ball. They don't really want to run the ball with Rachaad White. Considering they didn't make a trade at the trade deadline, they're not going to utilize him much on the ground despite it being an advantageous matchup. As long as he continues to look in the direction of Rachaad White, who has had 13 receptions and over 130 receiving yards in the last 2 games, if he continues to get yardage there, and of course has touchdown upside with Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, the expectation is another solid week here for Baker Mayfield. Moving on to our number 11, the Angry Bird himself, Sam Howell. Sam Howell is coming off an unbelievable performance, 75% passing completion percentage, 3 yards away from 400 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, over 30 fantasy points. Unbelievable. Now he has an opportunity of taking on the New England Patriots. The New England Patriots most recently have given up 3 touchdowns to Tua, 3 touchdowns to Josh Allen, 2 touchdowns to Derek Carr, and even gave up a touchdown to Jimmy Garoppolo. Can you imagine that? Over the course of the last 5 games, 4 of those games have been a base minimum of 18 fantasy points from Sam Howell. Of course, 2 of those against the Philadelphia Eagles, which is a huge difference maker, but nonetheless, the expectation is that Sam Howell should be another solid play within the given week. Moving on to our number 12, we have CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud earlier on in the season was a dependable quarterback. From weeks 2 through 4, he was averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game and had a total of 107 passing attempts throughout that span of time. Most recently, from weeks 5 through 8, of course, there's been a bye week throughout that span of time, but nonetheless, in the last 3 games, only averaging 13.74 fantasy points per game and has only had 86 total passing attempts. His passing attempt numbers are decreasing, which in turn decreases his overall yardage, passing touchdowns, and of course, fantasy points. That is worrisome. Hopefully, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it will be difficult for them to run the ball and will lead to CJ Stroud hopefully throwing the ball 35 plus times, because if in fact he does so, I do expect him to absolutely be a top 12 quarterback option. Moving on to our number 13, we have Jordan Love. Jordan Love is a very tricky player. Yes, he does end up scoring fantasy points, but he's a garbage man. I mean, he has consistently had himself on a weekly basis, 50 to 60% passing completion percentages. Nothing better than that. And that in itself is very concerning. But this upcoming week, there is an expectation taking on the Los Angeles Rams that maybe Jordan Love could be a little bit better in the first half if, in fact, Matthew Stafford is not starting on the opposite side. Without Matthew Stafford and Brett Rippon as the starting quarterback of the Los Angeles Rams, there may be a conversation in which the Green Bay Packers defense could force a couple potential 3-and-out situations, maybe a turnover. Short field positions could lead to touchdowns. Thus far this season, in the first half of games, Jordan Love only has 2 total touchdowns. In the second half of games, 11 total touchdowns. The Los Angeles Rams, thus far this season, they're allowing 12.3 points per game in the first half, 10.7 points per game in the second half. It's pretty even across the board. It's just a matter of, can Jordan Love find any semblance of value in the first half? If in fact he does, should be a great overall week for him. Moving on to our number 14, we have Gardner Minshew. Gardner Minshew, each of the last 2 games, 2 passing touchdowns minimum. Fantastic. This is an offense over the entire course of the season has accomplished something that no other offense has been able to accomplish. In every single game this season, the Indianapolis Colts have been able to put up a minimum of 20 points. Not a single other offense has been able to accomplish that. As long as we continue to see a high volume of points from this offense in an advantageous matchup taking on the Carolina Panthers, the expectation is a great overall week from Gardner Minshew. Moving on to our number 15 is Geno Smith. Geno Smith takes on the Baltimore Ravens. Yes, it is a difficult matchup. That is an elite defense as a whole. They lead the league in terms of total sacks. You got to keep Geno Smith protected. If in fact they do, fantastic. He'll make plays from the pocket. But oftentimes, as of late, he has made his fair share of mistakes. He has thrown 5 interceptions in the last 3 games. That is very unlike Geno Smith, especially when we compare that to 2022 Geno Smith. But nonetheless, this is the reality of the situation. In comparison to all other potential options at the quarterback position, despite the difficult matchup, despite the potential turnovers, I am expecting Geno Smith to be a solid play as our number 15 within the given week. Moving on to our number 16, we have Mac Jones. Mac Jones, again, has been decent. 2 passing touchdowns each of the last 2 games. I know he is not going to have guys like Devontae Parker or Kendrick Bourne within the given week, but taking on the Washington Commanders is the best matchup at the position. They're nearly allowing 19 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. They just went ahead and traded away 2 of their primary defensive linemen, Sweat and Young. I mean, that was the best facet of that defense. Their secondary cannot stop a soul. If there's no pass rush to go ahead and stop Mac Jones, he may be able to dice this defense up and find himself an even more successful week in week 9. The final player I wanted to mention as a potential option is Will Levis. He does play tonight. For those of you who are dealing with the potential injuries of, Kirk Cousins, Justin Fields, Matthew Stafford as of late, and potentially are dealing with a bye week like Brock Purdy, Trevor Lawrence, Russell Wilson, Jared Goff, with those potential options not available, Will Levis technically can be started tonight. Do I love it? No. But I will say that there is potential for success within the given week, considering the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary at times has not played well. And if the running game for the Tennessee Titans can find success, that play action game will only make it more successful for the potential of Will Levis. If he is not afraid of throwing the ball deep tonight, could have himself a couple big plays here. Just an honorable mention. Outside of that, play the other 16 options if they are available. Now that we've covered Will Levis, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about tonight's game between the Tennessee Titans and Pittsburgh Steelers in regards to putting together a couple pick'em slips via Underdog Fantasy. So going into tonight, my 2 favorite plays are Deontay Johnson going higher on his overall receiving yards. Again, last week with Kenny Pickett in the first half, had literally 11 total targets. So my expectation is that he should very easily be able to surpass this number. If you guys are a little bit worrisome, I do have another play here in which I picked Deontay Johnson just going higher than his 8.5 total targets. You can go ahead and run it that way. But otherwise, my 2 favorite plays, Deontay Johnson going higher on his overall receiving yards, and Derrick Henry going higher than his overall rushing yards, 71.5. I think that's a very easy number for him to accomplish. I know we have a very small sample size in terms of what Will Levis has been able to accomplish, but if in fact he can force defenses to respect him, it is only going to open up more opportunities of going ahead and allowing Derrick Henry to face less 8 defenders in the box kind of situations in comparison to earlier on in the season, which will only continue to allow him to rack up yardage within the game. On Sunday of last week, of course, had over 100 rushing yards. The hope is that he'll be able to rack up a similar number within tonight's game. That is my 2 favorite plays going into tonight. Again, you can go ahead, check out Underdog Fantasy, potentially follow, fade, put together your own pick'em slips, whether it's the NBA, whether it's the NFL, whether it's the NHL, whether it's esports, all that kind of jazz. All you got to do, use code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. You get a first time deposit match up to $500. So if you deposit 10, you'll get 10. You deposit 500, you'll get 500. You'll also be able to go ahead and get my rankings every single Sunday morning. Take advantage of the opportunity. Outside of that, Enjoy tonight's game. I'll be back tomorrow with some hidden gems. And until next time, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.